Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie. Storytelling is as old as humanity itself and plays an important role in the sacred and ritualistic life of religious communities. Stories of the Hebrew patriarchs, of the Buddha, and of all sorts of folk heroes help us understand our place in the world and help us make sense out of life. Storytelling and writing can also be an important spiritual practice in the lives of saints and seekers. My guest today is an expert on stories, and he might even weave a couple of tales of his own. Clark Maddux is a storyteller, philosopher, literary critic, extraordinary teacher and advocate for students, and just an all-around good guy. Welcome, Dr. Maddux. How are you?
Thank you. I'm well.
Yeah, Clark and I have been friends for a long time, and I wore the bow tie today in your honor. You taught me how an administrator should dress several years ago, and because of that, I learned how to tie a bow tie, so I appreciate that.
I feel bad that I'm not in one.
The next time, right? The next time you'll wear one. Tell us about yourself a little bit. You've been here several years now, and you've held administrative roles. You're a scholar. Tell us a little bit about what you do at Appalachian.
Sure. Well, my wife and I have been here 12 years now. We moved here from Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. I always said, and it was hard to leave Austin Peay, but I've always said that you have to like a school whose motto is "Let's go Peay."
I didn't know that was their motto.
That really is their motto.
Okay.
And so it was hard to leave there. We had a good group of friends there, but I came here to direct service learning in the ACT office. Mm-hmm. And then a couple of years later, I became the director of the Watauga Residential College, and since then have been in Watauga and interdisciplinary studies. My PhD is in early American studies and early American religious culture, and most of my scholarly work, when I'm not writing about other things, most of my scholarly work is on Cotton Mather, the 17th century Puritan.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of our scholarly interests intersect, right, is with that early American period. And I would like to talk about Cotton Mather later, sure, but yeah, I want to talk about this guy here.
Sure.
You brought an artifact with you that is on our set today, and this skull is legend among Wataugan students up the hill, and sits on your desk in your office. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. So this was given to me by a former faculty member in Watauga Residential College. She acquired it, or I guess she conveyed it from a retired anatomy professor. I do not know the name of that anatomy professor who gave it to her and passed it on to me. But like many people who study early modern periods, I've always had a fascination with the object of the memento mori, and I use it in that sense of remember that you will die. And mm-hmm. It sits on my desk where I look at it frequently, and I remind myself that this is what all of us will look like at some point in the future. The anatomy professor who passed it on to me gave me the provenance as she knew it. So what I know about it is it seems to be the skull of a subcontinental Indian male. Mm-hmm. It is more than 100 years old at this time, and of course, anatomy skeletons and artifacts were acquired differently 100 years ago, but she had had it for a very long time. It had been owned by somebody else, was my understanding prior to that. And her main concern, which I've always tried to respect, is that I treat it with some regard and respect as the only thing left of this man, the only thing that remains of him. And again, try to use it in just that way, to remind myself that that I am mortal and that I will die.
Some people might call that morbid thinking. but it's something that it seems to me that religion helps us to do, is to think about our own mortality and to put our life in some sort of perspective.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think that, and of course, I have to be forthright about my own religious leanings and backgrounds. I tend to call myself one of two things. I'll either say that I'm a Christian agnostic or that I'm a heterodox Christian. Both of those are not inaccurate, but the recurrent term there, Christian, does a lot to define who I am, and so I tend to think in those terms. I say that because I do think one of the great legacies of Judeo-Christian belief is a kind of fidelity to the human experience in all of its recurrence, repetition, and in all of its individual sorts of experiences. And I think part of that is not only that we're born and we live and we love and we marry and we work and we labor, but that we die as well.
Yeah.
And so I have never found that particularly morbid. I think it's essential to what we do. I have a lecture that I sometimes give to the Watauga students, and I titled that lecture "Et in Arcadia Ego," and I too am in Arcadia, of course, again, the great memento mori trope. And I think of that unironically, as the kids would say. You know, Paul Fussell in The Great War in Modern Memory points out that the value of the memento mori was in some sense literally blasted by World War I, and that it couldn't make sense given the carnage of World War I.
Yeah.
And while I certainly understand that point and sort of grapple with that in that lecture that I sometimes give to the students, I think it's important that we say to each other as human beings, I will remember you.
Right.
That I want to remember the people that I'm around, and I want them to remember me. And so part of what I think that object does is it ensures that in some way, if it's treated with some respect, some regard, even some sacredness.
Well, I asked you to bring it today in part because and I want to delve a little bit into your own personal experiences here, but you've taken up storytelling and writing in a slightly different way recently, and I've read some of the stories you've shared with me, and one of them, The Heart Has Reasons, where you reflect upon your own mortality because you had a kind of near experience of death, and maybe you can say a little bit about the process of writing about that as a kind of therapeutic release.
Yes, I think it's, again, what I've tried to do since the heart attack that I had that did literally quite almost kill me. And again, it was curious during that experience that it was not the heart attack that frightened me. It was the relatively brief TIA that I had, transient ischemic attack, in the hospital while I was recovering after the surgery. But I came out of that experience wanting to find meaning in language again. I think sometimes the danger of what we do in the scholarly world is that language and the experience of language can be cheapened and lessened, perhaps by our facility with it. And for me, it became important to sort of think about how I can, for lack of a better term, again, a Christian religious term, redeem language, at least for myself. No. And so they are, for me, those fairly long prose pieces that I've been writing have something of the quality of a prayer to them. Again, prayer is not something that is kind of easy for me. I'm a recovering preacher's kid.
I want to come back to that too.
And again, I think, when you're raised in that environment, you have to sort of reinvent your relationship with the sacred and with things that are meaningful to you, because they can become so rote and so ritual so easily.
Yeah. Recovering preacher's kid.
Yes.
Did you fit the stereotypical PK? I mean, you were always in trouble and rebelling, or were you?
Oh no.
No, you were well behaved.
I was the other one. That was my brother you're talking about.
Right, okay, all right. Well, what is life like growing up in a preacher's home? I imagine it presents itself with many comforts, but many challenges as well.
I think for us and for my brother and I, and we've talked a lot about this, I have one brother, it is that the lack of permanence, the transience. My brother and I I was actually a missionary's kid. My father was what at the time the Southern Baptist Convention called a home missionary. Mm-hmm. He spent most of his life in missions up in Michigan and Indiana and later in Montana. My brother counted up one time that by my brother's count, and I haven't gone through this, but I think he's right, we lived in something like 20 homes by the time I was 18. Mm. My brother was what Methodists would have called in the 19th century, or my dad was what Methodists would have called a circuit rider.
Right.
He would go establish a church, get it going, and then go somewhere else and establish another one. And so we moved as much as a military family, and the lack of a home was probably the most difficult thing that I think my brother and I had to face.
Well, it must have been terribly disrupting to education and
it was.
socializing, and all that goes along with being part of a community.
Yeah, I've always felt a kind of connection with military kids for that same reason, because we would move in the middle of a school year. We would be uprooted at the end of a fall semester and start the spring semester somewhere else. And again, I think my brother and I just sort of had different strategies. I sort of internalized my life and spent a lot of time in libraries, a lot of time between the covers of books. My brother became a very, very social person. And so my brother develops long-lasting friendships very quickly. I have very few friends, but I hang on to those for dear life.
Are you the older brother?
No, actually.
So you kind of reversed
We did.
in terms of the birth order thing, right?
We did, and we've often talked about that.
Okay, that's an interesting dynamic. I want to return to that in a little bit, but in the stories I've been reading that you've been writing, you're also telling. In your storytelling, you're talking about storytelling. And it occurs to me that storytelling is one of the constants of religion, from the birth of religion throughout the history of humankind. And stories do a lot of things. They communicate core beliefs, they reinforce community values, they help us deal with things like death and mortality. And for that reason, I think they're fundamentally important to religion. Can you reflect a little bit on that? Because I know you mentioned some stories from the Old Testament and from the Gospels, and maybe these stories that you've heard from your father's sermons growing up as well. But how would you describe the very important role that stories play in religion and in faith?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Again, I can kind of speak about my own faith experience. I've been very reluctant as I've gotten older to speak about religion writ large, and especially, even more particularly, maybe Christian religion, Christian belief writ large. I think what stories do is they remind us of, and this is again for me, they remind us of the human sacred bond, the connection that we have to and I'll use Orthodox language here, but the connection that we have to a divinity made in that made in that divinity's image, made in the likeness of that thing. And I think that's what they do, is they sort of take us outside of our little concerns, of the things that occupy us, of the things that take up our energy and our time and our own resources. And they lead us to think about things like, where are you and I sacred together?
Right. So they connect us to this kind of universal human experience. And earlier we were talking about aging parents and the struggles that we see our parents undergo. And you brought up the story of Isaac from the book of Genesis, toward the end of his life, having some of the same struggles that we're witnessing in our own parents. And that's really powerful to think about, that kind of connection to people through time and space.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Hebrew scripture does so well, and the Hebrew writings do so well, is they've got this marvelous ability to sort of compress a story down to its essences, so that you don't get a whole lot of background, a whole lot of what we would call in a novelistic story, a whole lot of character development. But everything is so boiled down and so condensed in Hebrew storytelling that who a person is and how they think and how they act is sort of magnified in many ways. So Jacob's duplicity and the complicity of Rebekah in dressing him up and slaughtering lambs to cover his head and his forearms to deceive her husband and his father. It's that scheming nature of both Rebekah and Jacob that just sort of comes to the forefront there. And Isaac's own fear and anxiety that not only is he dying, but he's blind and he's not sure that this person in his tent is his beloved son Esau, the one who's not in that scene. And he asks several times, are you my son? Are you really my beloved son? And it's just kind of heartbreaking in many ways when it's played out, when our parents might forget us, when they may not know who we are, and they talk to us as if either we're 12 years old or a now dead spouse or somebody that they don't know. And, that just kind of very sad nature of that is one of the things that I think those kinds of stories remind us of. But again, in doing that, what they do is they're placed in this matrix of providential history so that all of that means something. All of that has a purpose in some way.
Yeah, it's a very powerful story that you just recounted there. So in addition to finding meaning in storytelling and finding meaning in stories, I'm wondering about the writing process that you're going through and telling these stories. Is there something, could we say spiritual, about the creative process? Healing, yes. Therapeutic, yes. But is this a spiritual practice as well for you? I know it is for some people.
Yeah. I think it is. As I say, I think it's as close as I can come to prayer these days in many ways, to speaking with a divinity who's far beyond my own understanding or my capability to understand. And it's sort of just the expression of, I want to honor the experience that I'm having. I tell my students, and it is true, that good writing is rewriting, and that's an old truism. It's a cliche among teachers of writing. So I spend a lot of time trying to find exactly the right word, trying to find exactly the right tone. But there is also a sense in which I'm channeling my father and his father and their fathers before him, from what I understand, in that it becomes a kind of almost pulpit oratory, which I'm never quite sure how I feel about, but I'm aware of that coming across.
I've always thought your stories could be a nice Episcopal sermon. And they really are. They're well thought out. They're beautifully written. They're the right 10-minute length. And but I do want to ask you about one of your stories that I think is my favorite. 'Cause you mentioned your father and your brother, and you wrote this story called "Driving to Empire," which is an account of you going with your father on one of his missionary weekends. But within it, you embed the story of the prodigal son, and you bring out this kind of complex relationship between the brothers in that story, and between the brothers and the father, and give a really nice interpretation of the story of the prodigal son from the Gospels. But also, there's a lot of autobiography in that, I think, isn't there?
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So what about that filial relationship and conflict there that is so captivating? And you rightly point out that it's throughout, particularly the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Is that I don't know, a monomyth that Joseph Campbell might talk about, or is that part of our structure of thinking through in mythic terms about relationships?
I'm not sure. I think in some sense it is a reminder of, again, I'm not sure that I would use Campbellian terms to describe it, but it is this sense in which we have lived these stories before,
Yeah.
that in some ways there are no new stories, right? That it's our experience of them that makes them feel new, but the stories themselves are connected from way, way back in family and relationships with siblings, in stories that we heard. Actually, it's interesting that the great storyteller in our family, our nuclear family, was not my father. It was really my mother. My mother could always be counted on to just sort of spin these very short and, again, very compressed sorts of tales of her experiences growing up and her family's stories. But she sort of taught me to kind of think about how the structure of a story, how I am conveying that story, has meaning not so much to me, but to the people who are hearing the story. And so I think it is partly that. I also think that, again, I think part of what the great stories in Hebrew writing and Christian writing particularly do is they remind us that things don't work the way we plan on them working, but they work. And again, I'm very uncomfortable using traditional Christian language, but I always fall back on it. That fact is somehow miraculous, right? That I don't think it ought to work that way, but it does work that way.
Yeah.
And there's something curious about that kind of fascinates me.
Is it providence? Is it chance?
Yeah.
Or is it, or you do, for someone who's not comfortable using Christian language, you do it quite well. So.
That's from being a preacher.
Okay, all right.
I have no doubt.
Well, we've got a few minutes left. Let's switch gears and tell me what you want to tell me about Cotton Mather, an early Puritan writer. I know you're one of the editors on the Biblia Americana. So tell us about Cotton Mather. Who is this guy?
So Cotton Mather was a third-generation Puritan.
And a preacher's kid.
And a preacher's kid. And a grandson.
And a grandson of
preacher's kids. And his maternal grandfather was John Cotton, the great Puritan preacher. His paternal grandfather was Richard Mather, who had had his ears cropped by the realm when he lived in England and before he came to New England. His father was Increase Mather, and then Cotton, named for his maternal grandfather, was the first member of the Royal Society in the colonies. Wrote something like 700 manuscripts, about 400 of which were published in his lifetime. And some of those massive tomes, some of them just sermons that were published. But the family was very, very literate. And again, there's this kind of great family drama in the Mathers that has kind of always fascinated me. Increase Mather died of some terrible disease in his 80s. Increase was the one who renegotiated the colonial charter after the Restoration, and so ensured that the colonies in New England would have some level of independence during that period. And then Cotton, of course, he always wanted to be part of this larger European society, but was never able to leave the colonies, and so sort of spent his life in a very circumscribed area. His father, Increase, who died of some either bladder stone or cancer, died screaming in pain for weeks and weeks and weeks. And again, for a Puritan, that would have been a sign of the state of his soul, that he was unredeemed. And so Cotton just sort of having to live with that. But then he was also just this wonderfully tender father. His daughter, Hannah, would fall into a fire when she was very young and horribly, horribly burned. Shouldn't have lived probably, but he nursed her and cared for her during the time of her recovery so that she did live. And again, very unusual for the time, taught his daughter Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, since she had the capacity to do that.
Wow. Very interesting family.
Yeah.
Very interesting character, an important character, I know, in American history. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you coming on today, and I'm always amazed by the scope of your work, both scholarly and now with this kind of new project you're entertaining with your writing and creative pieces. So I can't wait to read more.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here today, Clark.
Of course.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for Religion and Life for this week. I hope you'll join us again next week on App TV when we continue to explore the relationship between religion, culture, and society. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwald.